21st of January 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province. Before dawn, Marine sentries heard only the wind through the perimeter wire. By 0730 hours, the first shells struck the ammunition dump. Hundreds of 82mm mortar rounds, artillery shells, and 122mm rockets rained down on the compound. Fuel drums exploded. Secondary detonations shook the runway. In Saigon, intelligence officers compiled casualty reports and revised enemy strength estimates upward. 17,000 regulars from the 304th and 325C divisions now surrounded the base. American commanders expected sustained pressure, but not this. North Vietnamese planners, however, had anticipated every detail. They had studied Dien Bien Phu for 14 years. They knew how long isolated bases could endure under bombardment. They understood the limits of air power. What followed was not an improvised siege, but a carefully designed campaign, one that would consume nearly 100,000 tons of American bombs and still achieve its strategic objectives. The hills around Khe Sanh had seen fighting before. 24th of April, 1967. Marine companies from the 26th Regiment fought People's Army of Vietnam forces on Hills 861 and 881. The hill fights lasted 3 weeks. 168 Marines died. 436 were wounded. North Vietnamese losses exceeded 800 confirmed dead. A staff officer at division headquarters compiled the after-action report. Casualty ratios, fire support effectiveness, helicopter evacuation times, all the data went into files that would later reach Hanoi. In the Ministry of National Defense, General Von Nguyen Giap reviewed those reports with interest. The numbers told a familiar story. American forces relied on mobility and firepower to offset numerical disadvantage. They built strongpoints along strategic routes and supplied them by air. Artillery and tactical aircraft provided close support. Helicopters evacuated casualties and delivered ammunition. The system worked, but it had limits. Giap had seen those limits before, at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French Union forces at Dien Bien Phu had occupied a valley surrounded by hills. They depended entirely on air resupply. Viet Minh artillery, positioned on the high ground, interdicted the airstrip and forced parachute drops. French defensive positions contracted under constant shelling. Trenches advanced toward the perimeter. After 57 days, the garrison surrendered. The victory changed Southeast Asian history. It also provided a template. Khe Sanh resembled Dien Bien Phu in key respects. The combat base sat on a plateau 600 meters above sea level, surrounded by higher terrain. Route 9, the main supply road, ran east to the coast. Mountains and dense jungle, limited ground access. The base depended on air support for survival. American planners believed mobility and firepower could offset these vulnerabilities. North Vietnamese planners saw an opportunity to test that assumption. The hill fights proved the concept. PAVN forces could mass around American strongpoints despite heavy bombardment. They could dig trenches and bunkers that survived tactical airstrikes. They could sustain operations for weeks under conditions that would break conventional formations. Casualties were acceptable if strategic goals were met. By late 1967, the General Staff concluded that a larger operation against Khe Sanh was feasible. Artillery would need to be brought forward. Approach trenches would require careful planning. Logistics would be challenging, but the fundamentals were sound. American intelligence detected the build-up but misread its purpose. In December 1967 and early January 1968, sensors along the demilitarized zone registered increased truck traffic. Aerial reconnaissance identified new trails and staging areas. Prisoner interrogations confirmed the presence of multiple PAVN divisions in western Quang Tri. Analysts concluded that enemy forces intended to attack strongpoints along Route 9 and the DMZ. They expected high-intensity combat. They did not anticipate a divisional-level siege designed to fix American forces, while a nationwide offensive unfolded elsewhere. On the 1st of January, 1968, an operational map lay on a conference table in Hanoi. Laos, Western Quang Tri, Route 9, Khe Sanh, and the electronic barrier system were marked in detail. General Tran Quy Hai and Political Commissar Le Quang Giao studied the terrain. Their orders came directly from the General Staff. The Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign would be one of the most important operations since American ground forces entered the war. Its objectives extended beyond the capture of a single base. Approximately 40,000 PAVN troops were assigned to the campaign. 17,200 belonged to the 304th and 325C divisions, which would conduct the siege itself. 16,900 served in the 320th and 324B divisions, tasked with blocking Route 9 and interdicting relief columns. 30 PT-76 light tanks were earmarked for the assault on Langve Special Forces camp and for mobile operations along the road network. Artillery included 130mm M46 field guns and 152mm D20 howitzers, both with ranges exceeding 20 kilometers. The plan was straightforward. Isolate Khe Sanh through sustained bombardment and ground pressure. Force American commanders to commit major air and ground resources to its defense. Threaten or neutralize other bases along Route 9, including Kar Lu, Camp Carroll, and the Rock Pile. Damage the electronic barrier system that the Americans hoped would interdict infiltration routes. Create conditions favorable for the broader Tet Offensive by tying down U.S. maneuver battalions in I Corps. Accept significant casualties in exchange for strategic leverage. Vietnamese campaign histories later described Route 9 Khe Sanh as designed to crush the enemy's strategic defensive line along Route 9 and the DMZ. The language was formal, but the intent was clear. This was not a raid or a spoiling attack. It was a deliberate campaign with defined objectives, allocated resources, and an expected duration. On paper, 40,000 North Vietnamese faced fewer than 6,000 Marines inside Khe Sanh itself. But American air power would drastically alter that ratio. The question was whether air power alone could decide the outcome. The key to the campaign lay in artillery. 10th of January, 1968. A convoy moved south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail near the Lao-Vietnam border. Trucks hauled 130mm and 152mm guns, disassembled into transportable loads. 122mm rocket launchers followed. Crates of shells and propellant charges filled additional vehicles. The column moved only at night, dispersing into camouflaged hides during daylight. American reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead, but the jungle canopy concealed most activity. PAVN artillery commanders had spent months surveying firing positions. The ideal sites lay just inside Laos, west of the Khe Sanh Plateau. From there, heavy guns could range the entire base area, while remaining beyond the effective reach of Marine 105mm and 155mm batteries. Counter-battery fire would be difficult. American rules of engagement restricted strikes into Laos, except under specific circumstances. Even when air attacks were authorized, gun crews could displace to alternate positions and resume firing within hours. Engineering units prepared the positions carefully. Earthworks protected guns from aerial observation and shrapnel. Approach roads allowed rapid movement of ammunition. Secondary positions provided fallback options if primary sites were compromised. The system drew directly on experience from Dien Bien Phu. There, Viet Minh artillery had survived weeks of French air attacks by using camouflage, dispersal, and redundancy. The same principles applied 14 years later. By mid-January, the guns were in place. Fire control teams calculated trajectories and target coordinates. Ammunition stocks accumulated in forward dumps. Observers on the high ground around Khe Sanh reported American defensive preparations, bunker construction, wire obstacles, minefields. Daily routines were monitored. Supply aircraft landing patterns were noted. The base had strengths. Strong points on hills 861 and 881. Extensive artillery support, direct. Radio contact with tactical air controllers. But it also had vulnerabilities. The single runway limited the number of aircraft that could land simultaneously. Fuel and ammunition were stored in above-ground tanks and bunkers. Defensive positions were compact, making area bombardment effective. U.S. Marine histories would later note that North Vietnamese artillery was located in Laos, a significant escalation in enemy fire support. For PAVN commanders, the placement of heavy guns beyond American artillery range was not an escalation, but a calculated requirement. Without it, sustained bombardment of Khe Sanh would be impossible. The goal was not simply to inflict casualties, but to create conditions that forced American forces to commit overwhelming resources to a single defensive position. Trench systems began advancing toward the perimeter in early January. Sappers dug approach trenches under cover of darkness, using techniques refined over years of siege warfare. Trenches zigzagged to minimize exposure to direct fire. Overhead cover protected against shell fragments. earth spoil was spread to avoid creating obvious signatures from the air. Progress was slow, meters per night, but steady. By the time the siege formally began, PAVN infantry would be within assault distance of American wire obstacles. American intelligence detected some of this activity. Sensor strings along likely avenues of approach registered movement. Patrols reported fresh earthworks. Aerial reconnaissance photographed suspicious areas. But the full extent of PAVN preparations remained hidden until the bombardment began. Once it started, the artillery fire plan had already been scheduled. PAVN gunners knew that their peak effort would exceed 1,300 rounds in a single day. They had stockpiled enough ammunition to sustain high rates of fire for weeks, and they understood that even under maximum American air attack, protected firing positions in Laos would allow them to continue operations. 21st of January, 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base, morning briefing at the command post. Colonel David Lowndes reviewed the overnight situation report. Sensor activations along western approaches, limited ground contact on Hill 881, weather forecast, low clouds, intermittent rain, routine defensive posture. Then the first shells impacted. Hundreds of 82mm mortar rounds fell across the base. Artillery shells struck the runway and taxiways. 122mm rockets arced in from the northwest. Within minutes, a massive secondary explosion erupted at the main ammunition dump. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. Detonations continued for hours as stored munitions cooked off. More than 1,500 tons of ammunition were destroyed, including the entire stock of tear gas rounds and most of the anti-aircraft ammunition. Black smoke obscured the base. Casualties mounted quickly. For PAVN units surrounding the base, this was the planned transition from preparation to active siege. Artillery batteries fired pre-arranged missions. Mortar teams engaged assigned target areas. Infantry probes tested defensive positions on hills 861 and 881. The coordination was precise. Rocket and artillery fire suppressed American defensive positions while infantry advanced. Mortar fire interdicted supply routes between the main base and outlying positions. The tempo was designed to overwhelm American response capabilities in the opening hours. The ammunition dump explosion achieved a key objective. With most artillery ammunition destroyed, marine batteries faced immediate shortages. Resupply would take days. In the interim, defensive fires were limited, giving PAVN forces greater freedom of movement. The psychological impact was equally significant. Defenders watched months of accumulated supplies vanish in minutes. The message was clear. PAVN artillery could strike anywhere in the base area, and no position was safe. Within 24 hours, the siege dynamic was established. PAVN forces controlled the high ground and could deliver sustained fire against the base. American forces held strong defensive positions, but were largely confined to fortified areas. Movement between positions was dangerous. Resupply depended entirely on air delivery. Casualties had to be evacuated by helicopter under fire. The tactical situation resembled Dien Bien Phu in essential respects, despite vast differences in available firepower. In Saigon, MACV headquarters responded by diverting major air assets to Khe Sanh. Tactical airstrikes targeted suspected artillery positions and troop concentrations. B-52 bombers flew intensive missions against areas where sensors indicated enemy presence. The commitment would eventually reach unprecedented levels, but on the first day, the key fact was that PAVN forces had achieved surprise, inflicted significant damage, and established the conditions for a protracted siege. Hanoi treated Khe Sanh as one axis in a wider campaign. Washington increasingly viewed it as the decisive battle of the war. 10th of February, 1968. 7th Air Force Headquarters, Saigon. A briefing chart displayed cumulative sortie and tonnage figures for Operation Niagara, the air campaign in support of Khe Sanh. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of B-52 sorties, thousands of tactical strikes, tens of thousands of tons of ordnance delivered. The goal was annihilation. American air planners expected that concentrated bombing would destroy massed PAVN formations and break the siege through sheer attrition. At a regimental command post west of Khe Sanh, a different set of records accumulated. Engineer logs noted tunnel depths and trench extensions. Medical reports tracked wounded evacuated to rear areas. Casualty returns listed killed in action by unit and date. The bombing was devastating. Entire companies disappeared under direct B-52 strikes. cratered landscapes testified to the tonnage expended. But formations remained intact. Units rotated through forward positions. Replacements arrived from staging areas. Operations continued. General William Westmoreland, commanding Military Assistance Command Vietnam, championed Operation Niagara as a test of American air power. If massive bombardment could defeat a conventional siege, it would validate the strategy of using firepower to offset numerical disadvantage. Tactical air and B-52 strikes would substitute for the ground reinforcements that political considerations made difficult to deploy. The official estimate held that 8 artillery shells or bomb equivalents were fired for every enemy soldier believed present in the target area, a ratio that should ensure destruction of any military formation. North Vietnamese General Van Tien Dung, coordinating operations from Hanoi, pushed field commanders to exploit opportunities despite the bombardment. Campaign directives emphasized that casualties were acceptable if operational objectives were met. Protective measures, tunnels, overhead cover, dispersal, reduced losses but could not eliminate them. By mid-March, PAVN records listed 1,436 wounded from the Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign. 484 returned to their units after treatment. 396 were evacuated north for extended care. Total killed in action over the campaign period reached 2,469. These were significant losses, far heavier than in most PAVN operations, but they were far below the 10,000 to 15,000 that American commanders claimed. The disparity had multiple causes. American casualty assessments relied heavily on body counts from airstrikes, which were notoriously unreliable. Bomb damage assessment was difficult in dense jungle. PAVN practice was to remove casualties from the battlefield whenever possible, making confirmation challenging. Intelligence estimates often double-counted units observed in multiple locations. The result was a systematic inflation of enemy losses that created a misleading picture of battlefield effectiveness. U.S. Air Force materials later described Operation Niagara as delivering a waterfall of bombs totaling 98,721 tons. For context, the entire combined bomber offensive against Germany in 1944 dropped approximately 900,000 tons over 12 months, an average of 75,000 tons per month across a continent. Khe Sanh received more tonnage than Germany did in an average month, concentrated on a few square kilometers over 77 days. One historian later called it probably the heaviest single bombing in the history of warfare. Yet PAVN artillery continued to set shelling records throughout the siege. The protective measures worked well enough. Tunnels absorbed blast. Effects: camouflage complicated targeting. Dispersal limited losses from single strikes. Redundancy ensured that even when entire positions were destroyed, others continued operations. The siege became a contest between American firepower, seeking to annihilate, and North Vietnamese survivability seeking to endure. Neither side achieved its maximum objective, but PAVN forces remained in the field long enough to accomplish their strategic purpose. 30th of January, 1968. Hanoi and major South Vietnamese cities. Radio traffic filled the operations center at PAVN Front headquarters. Attack reports came from Hue, Saigon, Da Nang, Nha Trang, and dozens of provincial towns. The Tet Offensive had begun. Coordinated assaults struck government buildings, military installations, and communication centers across South Vietnam. Urban combat erupted in places that had seen little fighting for years. The scale surprised American and South Vietnamese forces, despite intelligence warnings. For North Vietnamese planners, Khe Sanh and Tet were complementary operations, not alternatives. Campaign documents described the strategy as a general offensive and general uprising. Khe Sanh would fix American maneuver units and consume air and artillery resources in I Corps. Urban attacks would exploit the resulting dispersion of forces and demonstrate the vulnerability of government control even in cities. Popular uprisings were expected in some areas, though these materialized less than hoped. The overall goal was to shift the political and military dynamic through simultaneous coordinated action across multiple fronts. In Saigon and Washington, initial interpretation focused heavily on Khe Sanh. General Westmoreland believed the siege represented the main enemy effort. He compared it explicitly to Dien Bien Phu and committed to preventing a similar outcome. President Lyndon Johnson monitored the situation daily, at one point requiring the Joint Chiefs of Staff to provide written assurance that Khe Sanh could be held. The concentration of attention and resources on the besieged base was exactly what PAVN planners intended. American troop dispositions reflected this focus. Tens of thousands of Marines remained committed to I Corps and the Route 9 corridor. Artillery battalions supported the Khe Sanh sector. Air assets prioritized the siege area. When Tet attacks began, immediate reinforcement of threatened cities was constrained by existing commitments. The 1st Cavalry Division and other mobile reserves eventually deployed to relieve pressure, but the initial response was hampered by resource allocation to the northern front. Intelligence estimates further shaped decision-making. Massey V assessed PAVN's strength around Khe Sanh at 20,000 or more, based on sensor data, aerial reconnaissance, and intercepted communications. If correct, this represented a significant portion of North Vietnamese forces in the south. Destroying such a concentration would be a major victory. The expenditure of bombs and shells seemed justified by the opportunity to inflict decisive attrition. The possibility that the siege was a shaping operation for a broader campaign received less emphasis until urban fighting demonstrated the scope of Tet. By early March, Vietnamese campaign directives had already concluded that Route 9 Khe Sanh had largely fulfilled its purpose. American forces remained tied to the defense of the base and surrounding strongpoints. The barrier system along the DMZ had been disrupted. Urban combat in Hue and elsewhere absorbed forces that might otherwise have reinforced AFCOR. Casualties on both sides were heavy, but PAVN operational objectives had been substantially achieved. Hanoi judged the campaign a success, even while Khe Sanh itself remained under siege. The strategic calculus was straightforward. PAVN forces accepted high casualties and difficult operating conditions in exchange for fixing superior American firepower in a remote sector. The urban phase of Tet shocked American public opinion and strained South Vietnamese government control despite tactical defeats. Together, the two efforts created political pressure for negotiations and demonstrated that military progress was not translating into secure control of population centers. For North Vietnamese leadership, this was the desired outcome. Khe Sanh was not an end in itself, but a means to broader strategic goals. 1st of April, 1968, Route 9 Corridor, Quang Tri Province. Operation Pegasus, the relief of Khe Sanh, was underway. Elements of the 1st Cavalry Division advanced west along Route 9, supported by Marine units and extensive air and artillery preparation. PAVN after-action reports described contact with American forces at multiple points along the axis of advance. The 320th and 324B divisions were tasked with blocking or delaying the relief column, not stopping it outright. The mission was to trade space for attrition. PAVN units would contest key terrain, ambush vulnerable elements, and force American commanders to deploy maximum firepower to clear limited objectives. Each delay bought time, each engagement inflicted casualties. The overall effect was to make the relief operation costly and time-consuming, reinforcing the lesson that remote strongpoints were expensive to sustain. PT-76 light tanks played a significant role. On the 7th of February, 11 PT-76s overran Lang Vei Special Forces Camp, 4 kilometers southwest of Khe Sanh. The attack was the first major North Vietnamese tank operation of the war. Though the camp was only lightly held, the psychological impact was substantial. American forces had not previously faced armor in the northern provinces. The tanks demonstrated PAVN capability to conduct combined arms operations, even under heavy air interdiction. Along Route 9, PT-76s supported infantry assaults and provided mobile fire support. American armored cavalry responded with tank gun fire and anti-armor missiles. Close air support targeted any vehicle that exposed itself. Artillery fire disrupted concentrations. The PAVN armor performed adequately given the circumstances, but losses were heavy. The goal was never to achieve armored breakthrough, but to impose delay and extract cost. US accounts emphasized that combined fire from armored cavalry, artillery, and tactical air broke PAVN blocking positions at key points. This is accurate. American firepower advantages were overwhelming in open terrain. Where PAVN units tried to hold fixed positions against concentrated attacks, they suffered devastating casualties. But the objective was not to hold ground indefinitely. It was to make every kilometer of advance expensive and time-consuming. By mid-April, Operation Pegasus had formally relieved Khe Sanh. Supply convoys reached the base by road. Ground reinforcement was possible. The siege, in conventional terms, was over. But PAVN units still occupied much of the high ground around the plateau. Route 9 remained insecure. The relief corridor required constant protection. For Hanoi, the question was not whether the siege could be sustained indefinitely, but whether continuing pressure would yield additional strategic benefits. By late April, the decision was made to withdraw main forces and transition to lower-intensity operations in the sector. The decision reflected pragmatic calculation. Khe Sanh had served its purpose. American resources had been consumed. The barrier system was in disarray. Urban fighting during Tet had demonstrated vulnerabilities elsewhere. Sustaining a high-intensity siege while maintaining pressure in other sectors was logistically difficult. Casualties were significant. Withdrawing major units while keeping the base under intermittent fire made operational sense. American intelligence observed reduced contact and vacated positions, but interpreted these as signs of enemy defeat rather than planned redeployment. Sensor data showed fewer troops in forward areas. Aerial reconnaissance identified abandoned bunkers. Patrol reports noted diminished resistance. The narrative became that overwhelming firepower had broken the siege and forced PAVN withdrawal. This was partly true. Casualties from air and artillery strikes made some positions untenable, but the broader pattern reflected deliberate decisions in Hanoi about resource allocation and campaign priorities. When final after-action reports were compiled, both sides claimed significant enemy losses. American estimates cited thousands of PAVN killed. North Vietnamese records listed hundreds of US and South Vietnamese troops eliminated along the Route 9 corridor. Both were exaggerated. The real test was strategic. Who controlled the area 6 months later, and what had been accomplished at what cost? By those measures, the outcome was ambiguous. 31st of March, 1968, Saigon and Hanoi. Two sets of casualty figures circulated, each telling a different story. In Saigon, MECV staff compiled a classified statistical summary. As of the end of March, they assessed 5,550 PAVN killed in action around Khe Sanh, based on confirmed body counts, secondary sources, and intelligence estimates. This was an internal figure, marked secret. Public statements cited 10,000 to 15,000 enemy dead. The higher number included estimated casualties from airstrikes that could not be confirmed on the ground. In Hanoi, campaign historians assembled their own accounting. 2,469 PAVN soldiers killed in action during the Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign. 1,436 wounded, of whom 484 returned to duty and 396 were evacuated north. These numbers came from unit casualty reports, medical records, and personnel accounting systems. They were not publicized, but formed the basis for internal assessments. The gap between 10,000 to 15,000, 5,550, and 2,469 reflected differences in methodology, definition, and purpose. American public estimates served to demonstrate that overwhelming firepower had inflicted devastating losses, validating the strategy of airpower-centric attrition. MACV's internal estimate was more conservative, but still higher than PAVN records, reflecting the difficulty of accurate battle damage assessment in jungle terrain. Vietnamese figures excluded categories that US counts included, such as estimated casualties from B-52 strikes far from the base perimeter. Both sides also claimed to have eliminated large numbers of enemy troops. PAVN records stated that approximately 11,900 enemy personnel had been eliminated and about 197 aircraft destroyed in the Khe Sanh area. Eliminated included killed, wounded, and missing, a broader category than killed in action alone. Aircraft losses included helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft downed by ground fire, a figure that US sources disputed. American accounts listed far lower friendly casualties, 274 killed and 2,541 wounded in the base area itself, with higher totals when surrounding operations were included. The competing narratives allowed both sides to claim victory. For Washington, Khe Sanh was a successful defense that demonstrated American military superiority. Despite being besieged by numerically superior forces, the base held. Enemy losses were catastrophic. The relief operation succeeded. The narrative fit the broader message that American forces were winning the war through superior firepower and technology. For Hanoi, Route 9 Khe Sanh was a successful strategic operation that achieved its objectives. American forces were fixed in a remote sector. The barrier system was damaged. Urban attacks during Tet proceeded with less interference than they might have faced otherwise. While casualties were significant, they were acceptable given the strategic gains. The fact that American forces later evacuated the base confirmed that holding Khe Sanh had never been the objective. Tying down resources and inflicting cost had been the goal. The divergence in casualty figures shaped historical interpretation for decades. Each number supported a different conclusion. Public US estimates of 10,000 to 15,000 PAVN killed implied a devastating tactical defeat for North Vietnam. McVeigh's internal figure of 5,550 suggested a costly but successful defense. PAVN's 2,469 killed indicated heavy but sustainable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. All three numbers came from the same battle. None was simply invented. Each reflected the biases, limitations, and purposes of the organizations that compiled them. Later, historical analysis attempted to reconcile the accounts. The most likely explanation is that total PAVN losses fell between the internal US and North Vietnamese figures, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 killed, with several thousand more wounded. American air and artillery strikes inflicted severe casualties, but not at the rates initially claimed. PAVN protective measures and the difficulty of targeting dispersed forces in jungle reduced bombing effectiveness. Both sides overestimated their impact on the enemy, while underestimating the costs they absorbed themselves. The same battle produced three sets of numbers, one for public morale, one for internal assessment, and one for enemy records. Each served its purpose, each influenced how the siege was remembered. But the underlying military and strategic reality was more complex than any single statistic could capture. Khe Sanh demonstrated both the power of American firepower and its limits. It showed North Vietnamese willingness to accept heavy losses for strategic gains, and it proved that even overwhelming material advantage could not always translate into decisive battlefield outcomes when the enemy adapted and endured. 23rd of February 1968, Khe Sanh Combat Base. A daily shell count sheet on Colonel Lowndes' desk recorded 1,307 incoming mortar and artillery rounds in 8 hours. It was the heaviest single day of bombardment in the siege. Explosions walked across the base in sequence. Fuel drums burned. A supply dump containing 1,620 rounds of 90mm and 106mm anti-armor ammunition exploded, sending shrapnel across defensive positions. Marines crouched in bunkers and trenches waiting for the barrage to lift. For American commanders, such intense shelling suggested that a major ground assault was imminent. Conventional doctrine held that preparatory fires preceded infantry attacks. If PAVN forces were expending ammunition at this rate, they must be preparing to storm the perimeter. Defensive positions were reinforced. Artillery registered protective fires. Tactical air remained on strip alert. The garrison braced for the assault, but the assault did not come. PAVN artillery commanders were not preparing for a final attack. They were demonstrating that despite weeks of American counter-battery fire and airstrikes, North Vietnamese guns retained the capability to deliver concentrated bombardment. The shelling served multiple purposes. It maintained psychological pressure, destroyed supplies and equipment, disrupted operations, and proved that the siege apparatus remained intact. The disparity in firepower was staggering. Over the course of the siege, American forces fired approximately 150,000 artillery rounds in support of Khe Sanh. Nearly 100,000 tons of bombs fell on suspected PAVN positions. The daily expenditure of ordnance was unprecedented, yet PAVN artillery fired an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 rounds into the base area over the same period, enough to sustain constant pressure despite being vastly outgunned. The explanation lay in protected firing positions, ammunition supply, and crew discipline. PAVN gun crews fired from positions in Laos that were difficult for American artillery to reach. Ammunition came forward along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in nightly convoys that dispersed before dawn. Alternate firing positions allowed batteries to displace after each mission, complicating counter-battery targeting. When American airstrikes destroyed a position, crews moved to prepared alternates and resumed firing. Marine and naval gunfire records noted that much of the incoming fire originated from locations across the border, complicating response. Rules of engagement initially restricted strikes into Laos. When restrictions were eased, targeting remained difficult. Guns were camouflaged, dug in, and protected by overhead cover. Destruction required direct hits or near misses with heavy ordnance. Probability of kill for individual strikes was low. the volume of fire needed to suppress PAVN artillery exceeded even the massive expenditures already committed. The 1,307 rounds on the 23rd of February represented the peak, but shelling remained heavy throughout March. PAVN Artillery Command had planned for sustained operations. Ammunition stocks were sufficient for weeks of high-intensity fire. Crew rotation prevented fatigue degradation. Fire plans prioritized targets based on intelligence, ammunition dumps, fuel storage, aircraft on the runway, command posts. The effect was cumulative. Each day added to material destruction and psychological strain. From Hanoi's perspective, the bombardment validated the campaign design. PAVN forces had endured weeks of the heaviest bombing in history and still retained offensive capability. American defenders were confined to fortified positions, unable to maneuver freely or conduct sustained operations outside the wire. Resupply and casualty evacuation remained entirely dependent on air, which could be interdicted by ground fire and weather. The tactical situation favored neither side decisively, but it absorbed American resources at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely across multiple fronts. By the end of February, PAVN after-action reports already referenced preparations for eventual disengagement. The high point of the siege had passed. Main force units would begin to redeploy. Artillery batteries would reduce fire rates to conserve ammunition. The focus would shift from maximum pressure to maintaining enough contact to prevent American forces from redeploying elsewhere. Khe Sanh had served its purpose. What remained was to manage the transition while claiming maximum political and military advantage from the operation. 15th of March, 1968. Hills around Khe Sanh. A Marine intelligence summary noted reduced probing attacks and evidence of PAVN withdrawals from forward positions. Sensor data showed fewer troops near the perimeter. Aerial reconnaissance photographed vacated bunkers and trenches. Patrols found abandoned supply caches. The pattern suggested that enemy forces were pulling back, though bombardment continued at an average of 150 rounds per day. For US commanders, the signs indicated that maximum pressure from air and artillery strikes was forcing PAVN withdrawal. The narrative became that overwhelming firepower had achieved its purpose. Enemy forces, battered by weeks of bombardment, were disengaging before they could be annihilated. The siege was effectively over, even if formal relief had not yet occurred. Operational planning shifted toward reopening Route 9 and reducing the resource commitment to Khe Sanh. From the PAVN perspective, the decision to redeploy main forces reflected strategic calculation rather than battlefield defeat. Campaign objectives had been largely met. American troops and air assets were still tied to I Corps. The barrier system remained disrupted. Urban combat during Tet had demonstrated vulnerabilities elsewhere in South Vietnam. Sustaining a maximum effort siege while supporting operations in other areas was logistically difficult and strategically unnecessary. Redeploying forces allowed them to be used more productively in sectors where American presence was less concentrated. Vietnamese General Staff directives in March ordered selected units to withdraw from immediate contact, while maintaining artillery pressure and limited infantry operations. The goal was to transition from high-intensity siege to economy of force containment. Enough pressure would be maintained to prevent large-scale redeployment of American forces, but main combat units would redeploy to support operations elsewhere. The transition would be gradual to avoid presenting American forces with an obvious target for exploitation. American intelligence officers interpreted the evidence through the lens of their own operational assumptions. Maximum firepower applied against massed formations should produce withdrawal or destruction. The observed reduction in contact fit that model. What the interpretation missed was the distinction between tactical defeat and strategic redeployment. PAVN forces were not fleeing the battlefield. They were executing planned movements to new operational areas while maintaining enough pressure at Khe Sanh to constrain American options. Sensor data throughout March confirmed declining PAVN presence near the base perimeter. Acoustic and seismic sensors that had registered constant activity in February showed reduced traffic in March. Ground surveillance radar detected fewer large formations. Signals intelligence indicated that some units had moved to different sectors. All of these indicators supported the assessment that enemy forces were withdrawing under pressure, but bombardment statistics told a different story. Through the entire month of March, North Vietnamese artillery sustained an average of 150 shells per day, striking Khe Sanh. Some days saw significantly higher totals. The shelling was not random harassment, but carefully planned fire missions targeting supplies, aircraft, and defensive positions. Artillery observation remained effective. Guns remained operational despite constant counter-battery fire. The siege apparatus was still functioning even as infantry forces thinned out. The apparent contradiction, reduced ground contact but sustained artillery pressure, reflected PAVN operational flexibility. Main force infantry units could be more productively employed elsewhere. Artillery batteries, once emplaced and supplied, could continue operations with relatively small crews. The combination allowed North Vietnamese forces to maintain strategic pressure on Khe Sanh, while redeploying combat power to other areas. American forces remained tied to the defense of the base and the Route 9 corridor, even as the infantry threat diminished. By early April, the contrast between PAVN intentions and American perceptions was stark. Vietnamese staff officers were already planning operations in new sectors, treating Khe Sanh as a successfully completed phase. American commanders were preparing a relief operation to rescue a garrison they believed was still under imminent threat of assault. Operation Pegasus, which began on the 1st of April, achieved its tactical objectives of reopening Route 9 and reinforcing the base. But many of the PAVN units it was designed to destroy had already moved to different operational areas. The redeployment demonstrated a key asymmetry. American forces needed to secure and hold fixed positions to maintain their strategy of control and denial. PAVN forces could concentrate, engage, and withdraw based on strategic priorities, rather than terrain retention. The flexibility allowed North Vietnamese commanders to dictate the terms of engagement, choosing where to accept battle and where to avoid it. Khe Sanh had absorbed massive American resources for months. Now those same PAVN forces would engage elsewhere while smaller units kept pressure on the abandoned siege lines. When American ground forces finally reached Khe Sanh in strength during the first week of April, they found an enemy that had largely chosen to disengage. The relief was real. Supply convoys could move by road, and reinforcement was possible by ground. But the victory was incomplete. PAVN forces still held much of the surrounding terrain. Route 9 required constant security, and the strategic question remained: what had been accomplished at what cost, and who had achieved their objectives? 9th of July, 1968. Khe Sanh Plateau. North Vietnamese photographers recorded troops raising their flag over the ruins of Khe Sanh Combat Base. American forces had completed their withdrawal under Operation Charlie, demolishing installations to prevent their use by enemy forces. Bunkers were collapsed, runway matting was destroyed, fuel and ammunition that could not be evacuated were blown in place. After 77 days of siege and months of subsequent operations, the base was abandoned. The decision to evacuate reflected changed strategic priorities. In early April, Operation Pegasus had relieved the siege and restored ground access. American commanders celebrated the success and reaffirmed their commitment to holding Khe Sanh. But by June, operational realities forced reconsideration. The base consumed enormous resources in a remote sector with limited strategic value. Defending it required maintaining large forces along Route 9 and extensive air and artillery support. Mobile operations elsewhere in I Corps offered better prospects for engaging enemy forces and protecting population centres. MACV planners concluded that Khe Sanh was no longer worth the cost of defence. The barrier system concept had been effectively abandoned. The focus was shifting toward mobile operations and pacification programs in populated areas. Holding a remote firebase that absorbed disproportionate resources made less sense in the new operational environment. The decision to withdraw was presented as a tactical adjustment, not a strategic reversal. But the symbolism was unavoidable. For PAVN forces, the American evacuation was the decisive indicator of campaign success. Vietnamese sources described the base as liberated between the 9th and 15th of July. The language was carefully chosen. Liberation implied that the area had been contested and was now under control. It validated the Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign as a successful operation that forced abandonment of a key American position. The fact that the withdrawal was voluntary from the American perspective mattered less than the outcome. North. Vietnamese forces controlled the plateau that had been the focus of massive combat operations for half a year. Total casualty figures for both sides remained disputed. American losses at Khe Sanh proper were 274 killed and 2,541 wounded. When surrounding operations, Scotland, Pegasus, Scotland II and Charlie, were included, totals rose significantly. Exact figures varied by source, but several thousand American and South Vietnamese casualties resulted from the broader campaign. Equipment losses included numerous aircraft, vehicles, and large quantities of supplies. PAVN losses were heavier in absolute terms, but represented a smaller proportion of available forces. The official Vietnamese figure of 2,469 killed in action and 1,436 wounded covered only the Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign proper. Casualties in supporting operations raised totals further, but from Hanoi's perspective, the losses were sustainable and justified by results. American forces had committed massive resources to defend a position they ultimately abandoned. The barrier system was gone. PAVN infiltration routes into South Vietnam were more open than before the siege. Strategic objectives had been achieved. The contrast between relief in April and evacuation in July encapsulated the ambiguity of the entire operation. Tactically, American forces never lost control of Khe Sanh. The perimeter held throughout the siege. Enemy ground assaults were repulsed. The relief operation succeeded. By conventional military measures, the defense was successful, but strategically the base became untenable. The cost of holding it exceeded the value of the position. When American forces withdrew, North Vietnamese control of the region was restored. The question of who won the Battle of Khe Sanh depended on which metrics mattered more: tactical outcomes or strategic effects. Vietnamese campaign summaries emphasized the latter. Route 9 Khe Sanh was presented not as a failed attempt to overrun a fortified position, but as a successful campaign that achieved its objectives, fixing enemy forces, disrupting defensive systems, and eventually forcing abandonment of key positions. The narrative fit broader North Vietnamese strategy, which prioritized long-term strategic gains over short-term tactical victories. By that measure, Khe Sanh was a success despite heavy casualties and the failure to capture the base during the siege itself. 31st of December 1968. Hanoi, General Staff Review, a year-end assessment compiled outcomes of major operations. Route 9, Khe Sanh, featured prominently. The campaign had forced termination of the McNamara Line barrier concept. Khe Sanh Combat Base no longer existed as an American position. PAVN infiltration routes through Laos and western Quang Tri were more secure than at the start of the year. The assessment noted costs, thousands of casualties, significant equipment losses, and months of intensive operations, but judged them acceptable relative to strategic results. The McNamara Line had been designed to limit North Vietnamese infiltration across the demilitarized zone. Electronic sensors would detect movement, artillery and air strikes would interdict concentrations, strong points like Khe Sanh would anchor the system and provide fire support. The concept assumed that technology and firepower could substitute for the continuous physical barrier that terrain and manpower limitations made impractical. Implementation began in 1967 with sensor emplacement, construction of firebases, and deployment of specialized units. The Route 9 Khe Sanh campaign targeted this system directly. Threatening major strongpoints forced American commanders to concentrate resources on their defense. Sustained pressure demonstrated that even heavily fortified positions remained vulnerable when isolated and surrounded. The barrier system required secure logistics and freedom of movement to function. PAVN operations denied both. By mid-1968, construction of new barrier elements had stopped. Resources shifted to mobile operations and different defensive concepts. The system that was supposed to seal the DMZ never became operational. For North Vietnamese planners, this was a significant achievement. The barrier represented an American attempt to use technological advantage to offset numerical and geographical disadvantages. If successful, it would have complicated infiltration and increased casualties among units moving south. Defeating the concept validated PAVN operational methods and confirmed that technological solutions had limits against adaptive, determined opponents. The cost in casualties and resources was high, but the strategic payoff justified the investment. American expenditure at Khe Sanh was staggering, even by the standards of a war that consumed resources at unprecedented rates. Nearly 100,000 tons of bombs fell on suspected enemy positions around the base. Approximately 150,000 artillery rounds were fired in support of defensive operations. Aerial munitions costs alone exceeded $1 billion in 1968 currency values. Tens of thousands of troops were committed to I-Corps operations related to Khe Sanh and Route 9. The total cost of defending, relieving, and ultimately abandoning the base ran into billions of dollars and tied down forces for most of a year. The strategic return on that investment was questionable. Khe Sanh did not become the decisive battle that American commanders anticipated. Enemy forces were not destroyed in the numbers claimed. The siege did not prevent the Tet Offensive from achieving strategic surprise, and the barrier system that the base was supposed to anchor never functioned as designed. When the decision was made to abandon Khe Sanh, it tacitly acknowledged that the resources committed to its defense had not produced equivalent strategic value. Vietnamese assessments emphasized the positive outcomes. American forces diverted from other sectors, barrier construction halted, key defensive positions abandoned, infiltration routes secured. PAVN had accepted heavy casualties to achieve these results, but the strategic effects justified the costs. By late 1968, North Vietnamese forces had greater freedom of movement in Western Off Corps than they had enjoyed at the start of the year. Supply routes through Laos were more developed and better protected. The string of strongpoints that had threatened those routes no longer existed or had been reduced to minor installations. The termination of the barrier system had implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. It represented a failure of technological optimism, the belief that sensors, firepower, and mobility could substitute for the physical control of terrain that insurgent warfare made difficult. PAVN operations demonstrated that even massive material advantage could not guarantee control when the opponent adapted effectively and accepted necessary costs. The lessons would influence American strategy for the remainder of the war, though not always in ways that improved outcomes. Within a single calendar year, the base that was supposed to anchor the western end of the barrier had vanished, and the barrier system itself had been abandoned. The resources committed to Khe Sanh during that year exceeded the entire defense budgets of most nations. Yet the strategic situation at year's end favored North Vietnamese objectives more than American plans. For Hanoi, this validated the strategy pursued throughout the campaign. For Washington, it raised difficult questions about whether resources and lives had been committed to achievable objectives or had simply been consumed in operationally indecisive combat. 21st of January, 1978, Hanoi and Washington, 10th anniversary commentaries. Parallel articles appeared marking a decade since the siege began. American military journals described Khe Sanh as one of the greatest defensive victories of the war, emphasizing the successful defense against overwhelming odds and the massive enemy casualties inflicted. Vietnamese publications framed Route 9 Khe Sanh as a major offensive success that contributed to the eventual defeat of American strategy. Both narratives were true from their respective perspectives. Both omitted inconvenient complexities. The American narrative focused on tactical outcomes. The base held throughout the siege. Enemy ground assaults were repulsed. The relief operation succeeded. Estimated enemy casualties vastly exceeded American losses. By conventional military standards, these were indicators of victory. The fact that the base was later evacuated was treated as an operational decision rather than a strategic defeat. The focus remained on the successful defense during the siege itself, rather than on the broader campaign context. The Vietnamese narrative emphasized strategic effects. American forces were fixed in a remote sector while Tet operations proceeded elsewhere. The barrier system was terminated. Key defensive positions were ultimately abandoned. PAVN control of the region was restored. While casualties were significant, they were acceptable relative to the objectives achieved. The siege demonstrated that American firepower, despite its overwhelming scale, could not prevent North Vietnamese forces from accomplishing their strategic purposes when they accepted necessary costs. Compiled records showed a more complex picture than either simple narrative captured. PAVN order of battle for the campaign totaled approximately 40,000 troops assigned across multiple divisions. American and Allied strength in the broader area of operations reached about 45,000, including 6,000 Marines in Khe Sanh itself, and larger forces along Route 9 and in supporting areas. The numerical advantage that dominated popular accounts was less clear-cut when broader force allocations were considered. Casualty figures remained disputed. American losses at Khe Sanh proper were 274 killed and 2,541 wounded. Significant, but not catastrophic for a 77-day siege. Broader operations raised totals considerably. PAVN acknowledged 2,469 killed and 1,436 wounded for Route 9 Khe Sanh. American estimates ranged from 5,550 to 15,000 enemy killed, depending on source and methodology. The gap reflected different counting methods, definitions, and strategic purposes rather than simple dishonesty on either side. Air and artillery expenditure was beyond dispute. Approximately 100,000 tons of bombs and 150,000 artillery rounds were fired in support of Khe Sanh. No comparable bombardment had been concentrated on such a small area in such a short time. The tonnage exceeded monthly averages from the strategic bombing campaigns of the Second World War, applied to entire countries, yet PAVN forces remained in the field and accomplished their operational objectives despite these unprecedented attacks. The strategic outcome was that both sides claimed victory while the region itself changed hands. American forces held Khe Sanh during the siege, withdrew voluntarily afterward, and eventually left Vietnam entirely in 1973. North Vietnamese forces controlled western Quang Tri by mid-1968 and retained control through reunification in 1975. The barrier system was abandoned. Infiltration routes remained open. By these measures, North Vietnamese objectives were substantially achieved despite heavy battlefield losses. The key to understanding the battle lay in recognizing the different strategic frameworks each side applied. American strategy emphasized attrition and technological advantage. If sufficient firepower could be concentrated against enemy forces, they would be destroyed and the war would be won. Khe Sanh was designed to test this proposition under ideal conditions. Enemy forces were concentrated. Targeting was relatively straightforward. Firepower was unlimited, yet the expected decisive attrition did not occur. PAVN forces survived, accomplished their objectives, and eventually occupied the ground they had contested. North Vietnamese strategy accepted heavy casualties as the price of achieving strategic effects, tying down American forces, disrupting defensive systems, and demonstrating the limits of firepower-centric approaches were worth significant losses if they advanced broader goals. Khe Sanh was never intended to be captured through direct assault. It was meant to fix American resources, support the Tet Offensive, and ultimately prove untenable to defend. By those measures, the campaign succeeded, despite failing to overrun the base during the siege. 10th anniversary assessments in both countries reflected these divergent frameworks. American accounts focused on body counts, bomb tonnages, and the tactical defense of the base. Vietnamese accounts emphasized strategic leverage, political impact, and territorial outcomes. Neither was complete. The battle demonstrated both the power of American firepower and its limits when applied against dispersed, protected, and determined opposition. It showed North Vietnamese willingness to accept heavy casualties for strategic gains, but also the high cost of that approach. The shell counts, bomb tonnages, and casualty tables all pointed to one documented result. After Khe Sanh, the western approaches to South Vietnam belonged to Hanoi, even as Washington continued to cite the battle as proof of American strength. The divergence between tactical success and strategic outcome encapsulated the broader difficulties that would characterize American involvement in Vietnam until withdrawal. Superior firepower, technological advantage, and tactical victories did not translate into strategic control when the opponent adapted, endured, and pursued different objectives than those assumed by American planners.